Star Trek II Short Stories, Part 3, Story 4, The Secret Empire. The star system of Omicron Theta was a wreck. 5 planets orbited the Class M sun. 2 were distant gas giants, 1 a near molten ball close to the star, and 2 were seared, lifeless worlds. 3 long, thin belts of shattered rock circled the sun where planets had once turned. Natural disaster or war? Kirk asked. My readings indicate an atomic war of immense magnitude, Admiral, enough to tear planets apart. Radiation? Minimal. The wars were well over 1,000 years ago. Kirk sighed. Well, I suppose we should give them a quick survey as long as we're here, then move on. Mr. Spock, would you like to head the party? Either one of those ruined worlds would be enough, I think. We'll leave the rest for the scout ships. Yes, Admiral, I'd be most interested. The outermost of the 2 ruined planets would be the more appropriate. Mr. Chekhov, put us in orbit. He thumbed a stud. Transporter room. Prepare to beam down a party. He grinned at the Vulcan. Good luck, Mr. Spock. The Vulcan raised his eyebrow. Luck, Admiral, is no substitute for preparedness. The surface of Omicron Theta 5 was a bleak, nearly airless land where only tortured scrubs of grayish bushes grew. There were lakes of molten glass as large as American states and vast deserts of seared soil and shattered mountains. There was no life. Only a weak, fitful wind stirred the sands. 5 shafts of light were the first new thing which had appeared on the surface of the cratered planet in over 1,000 years. The light sparkled and took shape, and 5 stood on the smooth surface, bulky in their spacesuits. Mr. Sulu, collect what biological specimens you can, Spock said over his suit radio. Sergeant Galloway, establish a lookout post. That hummock should do. Midshipman Chang, document the tricorder readings. And me? Lieutenant Commander Uhura asked. Basic observation, Commander. See what you can see. We meet here in 1 hour. Aye, sir, they all said and separated to explore. 40 minutes later, Uhura looked at her wrist chronometer and estimated how long it would take to return. She'd been wandering through the crevices and folds of the melted landscape, finding little. Here and there was some unmarked feature of the old landscape, sheltered by a cliff or outcropping, but it told her little. She turned to go back and took another slippery gully which promised to come approximately back toward the prominence where they had beamed down. The walking was difficult in the suit, as she could not see her feet all that clearly, and the ground was glassy with flamed soil. Uhura rounded a corner and gasped as she saw a hunchbacked shadow, and gave a great sigh of relief as she realized it was Spock in his cumbersome spacesuit. You frightened me, she admitted. Spock did not answer, and she looked at what he was looking at. A little way off, sheltered in a fold of rock, was an artificial structure, a masonry block, with a low, square doorway. On top of the block was a pair of feet carved in stone and sheared off just above the huge ankles. What is it? She asked, excited and expectant. A monument from whatever ancient race once lived here, Spock said. Notice the doorway. There's a bit of sand against it, but I think we can remove that with our phasers. Without waiting for comment, Spock moved forward, adjusting his phaser to disintegrate, but with a limited range. His weapon sent out a fiery ray which sparked over the sand, dissolving it away in layers until the door was relatively free of the impeding sand. Spock pressed against the door in the stone opening, but could not budge it. Uhura helped, but neither could move the metal door, which was corroded and warped. Spock looked at his watch and lifted his phaser. The door vibrated into nothingness and dust swirled out. Spock turned on his helmet light and looked in, stepping through a moment later. Uhura looked nervously around. Mr. Spock, she said, what do you see? An interesting passage, slanting sharply down, he replied. Inform the ship I shall investigate for 10 minutes and return. Mr. Spock, may I come with you? If you wish. Uhura reported to the Enterprise, and Captain Kirk replied, Don't stay too long and don't go too deep." "Aye, sir," she said, and went into the base of the huge ruined statue. The walls were of large blocks of native stone, ruptured here and there as if by an earthquake. A few feet inside, the floor slanted sharply down, and a few feet beyond that, one wall and part of the ceiling had totally collapsed, spreading stone, rough rocks, and dirt over the narrow floor. Uhura hurried on and soon caught up with Spock. "What is this place?" "Unknown," he replied. "Perhaps some kind of secret or seldom used passage to the surface from some ancient underground structure." "It's spooky," she said. "Hardly a scientific description," Spock said dryly. The passage turned, and there were steps down, then more turnings and more steps. Here and there the smooth stones were absent, and the roughly hewn walls of natural rock were seen. The steps and turnings seemed endless, and Uhura was already thinking of the long climb back. "Mrs. Spock, it's about time we went back," she radioed. Look, a room of some sort." The steps led into a small stone-walled room with thick dust on the floor and a rusted piece of metal leaning against the wall. "That looks like a spear," Uhura said. "Interesting, but we have run out of time," Spock said. He looked into one of the two passages leading from the room, flashing his helmet light downward. He turned toward the other passage when out of the dark passage charged a half-dozen shrilly chittering critters like monstrously large insects, spears flashing in the helmet light. Uhura screamed and reached for her phaser. It was set on stun, and she downed one of the creatures before she was knocked over. Her head hit the back of her helmet, and she was knocked unconscious. Spock had his phaser on kill, but he did not use it. He struck out at one of the attackers with a gloved fist, sending it crashing against the wall, where it toppled forward limply. But the others smashed into Spock, bearing him down. Uhura awoke, and immediately her senses were assaulted. Smells, something like onion, sweet, oil, a touch of some spice, and a rather sickening perfume. Noises, clucks, hums, a low throbbing, an echoing cry, a voice saying something she didn't understand. She opened her eyes. She lay on a rather dirty floor of some cold concrete-like material. Her protective spacesuit was gone, as was her outer uniform. Her phaser, communicator, and other gear were also missing. Two creatures like giant erect cockroaches stood looking at her with eyes on stalks. They were the size of a small human and had slim metal spears. A narrow metal collar circled each thorax, but they were otherwise without clothing. Carefully, Uhura sat up, her eyes on the cockroach-like creatures, her stomach churning in disgust. "Careful," she thought. "They're intelligent. The spears show use of tools." She put her back against the concrete wall and got very slowly to her feet. It was cool in the corridor, but not cold. A cockroach came out of a nearby passageway and walked by with a kind of hopping motion, one eye stalk swiveling to look at Uhura. "Don't think of them as cockroaches," Uhura thought. "That might trap you into a line of thinking that could be fatal." She looked round. "Mr. Spock," she said softly. The tendrils atop the cockroaches twitched, but they didn't move. "Mr. Spock," she said louder. One of the cockroaches shifted position, but neither of them said or did anything. Uhura started edging along the wall toward the passageway to her left. The cockroach guards calmly moved along with her, keeping her within striking distance of their spears. Uhura looked around the corner and saw Commander Spock standing tall amid a dozen or so of the cockroaches. He seemed to be working on something. Mr. Spock?" The Vulcan looked at her. A dozen pairs of stalked eyes also turned to look, and Uhura gulped. "Ah." "Ah, Ms. Uhura, you're well. I gave you a brief examination earlier, and you seem basically unharmed." I have a headache, but..." She waved at the cockroaches. What are these?" "As yet undetermined," Spock said. The cockroaches moved, and Uhura saw that Spock was wearing only his Vulcan inner heating garment. To the Vulcan, raised on that planet's 140-degree mean temperature, these cool underground passages must be icy. Spock pointed. "Your clothes are there. We researched for weapons." Uhura shivered, thinking of the thin, delicate mandibles of the cockroaches touching her. She saw her uniform and went slowly to it and dressed quickly. "What are you working on?" Again, the stalked eyeballs turned in her direction. "A universal translator. Although this hand-carried unit has a link to the ship's computer, it's quite limited, but I'm trying to adapt it." They talk?" Uhura realized she had not heard them say anything. "Naturally." "How do they know that is what you're doing?" she asked, doing up the last fastening in her sleekly tailored uniform and feeling much better for it. "They don't, but I have proceeded openly and cautiously." He clicked something in place and spoke into the device. "Greetings. We come in peace." At the same time, with only a momentary lag, the translator's speaker let out a chittering which caused a dozen or so cockroach-like creatures to step back in alarm. "Do not fear," Spock said slowly and distinctly. "We mean you no harm." There was a sudden burst of chittering from almost all the cockroaches, and the translator blinked red. Spock held up his hand and stood motionless until they all stopped. Then he held the machine toward the nearest of the creatures, saying, "You speak." A shrill chittering was quickly translated into a rather harsh, garbled, accented voice, saying, "Who are you, tall ones? How can you be skinned and live?" For the first time, Uhura felt like laughing, but she stifled the impulse. Solemnly, Spock said, "Those were protective garments. We are from the United Federation of Planets. Our starship, the USS Enterprise, is in orbit above this world." The cockroaches stirred angrily. There was a wild swaying of long antennae and a tense gripping of thin spears. Uhura backed up, looking around for her phaser and communicator. The translator blinked red again as the cockroaches all chittered at once. Then finally one of them seemed to shut down the others. "To the masters! We take them for justice to the masters." There was much milling around, but the swaying eye stalks were very curious. As Spock calmly donned his uniform, ignoring the stabbing motions of the spears, he looked at Uhura and motioned with a tilt of his head. They went out into the passage, surrounded by the chest-high mob of brown creatures. Uhura could examine them more closely as they walked briskly along, but didn't really want to. Outside of admiring a dark brown chitinous carapace and very strong with thin legs and arms, she had no taste for the creatures. "Why do they have to look like cockroaches of all things?" she thought. They went downstairs and ramps and long slanting corridors. The walls were sometimes roughly hewn blocks of stone, sometimes rather crudely poured concrete, and sometimes the natural rock of caverns and caves. They passed many branching corridors, past rooms and caverns filled with an odd variety of things. One great cavern was a kind of farm, with purple-gray plants growing under amber lights and producing great yellowing melon-like fruit. Another room was filled with whitish cubes of some kind of compressed vegetable material. A long passage contained many small rooms stacked with dull red cylinders of a clay-like substance, yellow strips, rolls in big loops or bales of purple-gray leaves. They saw an underground lake or pool of a dark green liquid in a cavern where 100 cockroaches attended to a field of bright green plants with tiny red berries, brightly lit by a bank of yellow lights. Then the corridor walls seemed smoother, cleaner, and more regular. The cockroaches they met were without spears, but seemed to have more authority. There was almost a fight between the spear-carrying roaches and a band of new ones, wearing a knotted red string around their carapaces. At last they were allowed to proceed, but with only 5 of the spear carriers going with them. They came to a guarded door and were allowed through, and Uhura's eyes opened in surprise. It was warmer here, with high arched corridors and spacious rooms with furniture. A wall screen in one room was displaying a complex geometric pattern of moving color. Cockroaches passed by with metal bowls of yellow puffballs or small dark berries. But it was the inhabitants which surprised both Spock and Uhura. Uhura, at least, had been expecting more of the cockroaches, but instead she saw several totally new creatures, small humanoids with burnished dark skin, high foreheads, and thick ponytails of black hair. They were obviously mammals, and wore colorful clothing in many hues. The first one who saw them exclaimed something in a high piping yell, and the translator said, "Gods of Malfor! Giants!" Several of them gathered and crowded close, touching both Spock and Uhura, chattering, their eyes bright with excitement. The translator, overloaded with too many words, just blinked red again. "Mr. Spock, you are an officer in Starfleet, Lieutenant Commander Uhura, and you are expected to act like one." "Fine," she said, "but how are you supposed to act?" "Dignified," he replied. Uhura gave him a hard look. "Easy for you," she thought. "You're always dignified." Their little band grew at every intersection, with more of the well-formed but diminutive humanoids joining them. The chatter was shrill and incomprehensible. Then they came to the big metal doors, where for the first time there were humanoid guards. They conversed for a few moments with the cockroaches, and then the doors were opened. "An airlock," Uhura said, looking around her. The first door closed behind them. The guards eyed them with a mixture of hatred, curiosity, fear, and what Uhura could only interpret as a kind of attraction. The inner airlock opened, and they were in a much more richly decorated section. The ceilings were higher, and the walls made of beautifully patterned stone. Tapestries hung from the walls, and Uhura saw Spock studying them as they passed. The imagery was not very realistic by Terran standards, more given to symbols and colors than actual figures, though there were some. "Fascinating," Spock said to her. "I think this indicates a long rivalry between the inhabitants of this planet and another species. They spread out to other planets, and there were wars over disputed worlds, culminating in the destruction of several." "Who won?" Spock shrugged. "Who wins any war fought with atomic weapons? There were no winners, and the remnants live here in what was once a fort or perhaps a royal bomb shelter." "And these creatures," she said, indicating the cockroach-like guards. "Look at that tapestry." A single humanoid figure stood atop a pile of what appeared to be dead or submissive cockroaches. "A slave species, perhaps bred from prisoners of war?" Uhura shivered, and then they were at a tall, curtained entrance. Humanoid guards opened the curtains, and they were ushered through. It was a large room with a strange floor that was not flat, but instead rose and fell gently, smoothly, to pinnacles and hollows. Atop one of the pinnacles was a cluster of thrones with built-in tables piled with what Uhura assumed were fruit. Statuary was tightly pressed into the cluster, as was a stone pot with a small, brightly colored bush growing in it. In each throne was a humanoid figure, a miniature human dressed in silks and jewels, with many rings, bracelets, necklaces, and earrings, which were worn by both sexes. At the top was a rather fat individual, with a young and pretty female on either side. Just below him sat a resplendent female with a muscular young male on either side. "Beric, what have you found? Lord of the Cavern, most gracious King of the Inner Chamber, victorious monarch of the 8 worlds, destroyer of the slow-witted insects, predetermined leader of—" "Beric, never mind that. Who are these giants?" "Invaders, most majestic of all the great kings. The outer guards captured them, O singer of the great victory songs. Be silent, Beric. Giants, come closer." Spock and Uhura moved carefully through the surrounding mob of cockroaches and nobles. "Ah," the king said. "Striking. Outrageously large, but—" The queen, or who Uhura assumed was a queen-like person, spoke up. "The male has pointed ears. The giant has pointed ears." For some reason that seemed to cause a wave of tittering laughter. Spock merely looked at them with a raised eyebrow. "Quiet," the king ordered. "Who are you, invaders? Why have you come here?" "Oh, great monarch of the citadel of safety," Beric said, "bringer of safe walls and water. The Chittics say they're from a starship." A gasp came over all the humanoids in the throne room. From his tower of thrones, the king spoke sharply. "I asked the dark giant Beric. You," he said, pointing a beringed finger at Spock. "Is this true?" "Your Majesty," Spock began, giving a slight bow. "It is true. We are officers from a starship sent by a great empire to contact you. I am Ambassador Spock, and this is Ambassador Uhura. We have come to rescue you." There was a hissing of breath, and the king looked angry. "Rescue us? We do not need rescue, Ambassador. We have lived here for 2,000 years. We are comfortable. We command. We rule the 8 planets of Tereki." "Majesty, there are only 5, and—" "Stop!" the king's voice thundered out. "You lie! We rule over 8 worlds." He speaks truth, Majesty," Uhura said. 2 are shattered into debris, and this planet and another are lifeless, and— "No!" the king bellowed, standing. The hands of the slave girls reached for him, but he slapped them away. Outraged, she screamed in anger. "I rule! I, Battalion the 41st, I rule the 8 worlds. We won the Second Great War. We defeated the Chittick. Look at them now, slaves!" "Nevertheless," Spock said calmly, "all the planets once capable of life are destroyed or lifeless." "No!" King Battalion bellowed. "You lie! You lie!" He fell back onto his throne to be caressed and kissed. "Majesty, if you were to return to us a certain device," Spock said, "I could demonstrate the truth of what I say." "What?" the Queen stood. "How can one demonstrate an untruth?" "One cannot, Majesty," Spock said, giving her a slight bow, "but one can demonstrate a truth." "How?" she said haughtily. "Not even the makers of dreams can do that." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you a secret maker?" "No, Majesty, merely an ambassador from a great empire who wishes only to learn." She seemed mollified and sat down. "We will think of this. Battalion?" Yes, indeed, we must think of this. Take them away," he said. "Give them food and watch them." "Yes, giver of air," Eric said. "At once, Prince of Stars, protector of the green." The king made a rude noise, and so did the universal translator. They took Spock and Uhura away to a well-guarded room not far away. There were rose stone walls, a tapestry depicting the hand-to-hand combat between a king and a giant cockroach, a bowl of yellow fruit, and a great low bed. Uhura looked at Spock as they were alone. "Turn it off," she said, pointing at the translator. "We can't be overheard that way." Spock snapped the device off. "Yes?" "You lied to them, Mr. Spock. I thought Vulcans did not lie." "I did not lie. The first contact of any species means that those coming are ambassadors, and is a federation, not a great empire." "Okay, Mr. Spock, you certainly do seek to learn. But coming to rescue them?" "They're living in a dead-end society, one based on slave labor. No society like that has lasted. We can transport them to new worlds, giving each a new start. I use the terms I did so that they would be within the range of their understanding. If we can recover our communicators, we can do all that." "I get the feeling they want to stay as they are," Uhura said. "All societies resist change. I have no desire to violate the Prime Directive. We will make a case for immigration and let them decide." "But what if—" They were interrupted by a humanoid noble. Spock turned on the translator. He smiled oddly and gave a slight bow. "Ambassador Uhura?" "Uhura, yes." "The great sovereign of the inner world has sent me to bring you to him." Uhura looked at Spock, then said, "Why?" The noble shrugged. "The Zamarin of the Chittick slaves does but speak, and I obey." "Shall I?" Uhura asked Spock. He nodded absently, which made the young officer a bit angry. "Very well. Lead on, Macduff." "My name is Count Alvic, Ambassador," the small human said, puzzled. "You'll need this," Spock said, handing her the translator. She took it and followed the Count. They went past the throne room, down some wide, curving steps into the ornate doors of private quarters. Uhura was beginning to get nervous. King Battalion was waiting for her alone. He dismissed Count Alvic at once. "How is it you understand us and we you?" he asked, and she showed him the translator. "Excellent. Yours must be a great empire. Come, sit here beside me." He was sitting on a wide couch covered in multicolored fur. He poured her a crystal glass of some yellow liquid, but she refused. Please, Your Majesty, I'm not being rude, but it would be dangerous for me to consume untested food or drink. It might even be dangerous for me to breathe this air, or for you to breathe the same air as I do. There are diseases The king waved all that aside as nonsense, but he put down the glass. He looked her over critically. I have never seen one like you before. You are distressingly large, grotesque even, yet I am attracted to you. Uhura concealed her amusement, for the king was half her size, although perfectly proportioned. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said, evading his hands gracefully. But as ambassador, I am forbidden to have anything to do with those I am dealing with. King Bedalian's face fell in disappointment. You were such a challenge, he sighed. Oh, it's not easy being king here. It's the same thing year after year, Nothing much new happens. I must decree all the fads, We'd be really bored if we didn't have fads. He jumped down from the bed and strode around. Last year it was shaven heads and core designs painted on. Year before, the 10-year cycle of nudity, excepting jewelry, of course. 3 years ago, the cave bear fad. Next year, he sighed again, it's a yellow cycle. So boring, but it's traditional. How can it be a fad if it's traditional? Uhura asked. Because we must feign surprise or it's no fun at all. Are you absolutely certain your duties will not let you, cavort a little? Oh, absolutely, she said solemnly. Your Majesty, if you would restore our communicators to us, those are the little metal boxes that fit in your hand, we could show you some extraordinary sights that... No, I know ambassadors. The second King Bedalian, he let the Chittick ambassador into the palace. Oh, it was such a great palace, too, on the shores of a lake, and that ambassador ruined the power thing that kept the guardians in the sky. Abruptly, the king turned to Uhura. You've been there yourself. What is sky? It's the atmospheric envelope that covers a planet. The gases of the atmosphere which one breathes. It's thickest at the bottom, at the surface, and gets thinner and thinner as you go up, until there are no gases, and that's space. Bedalian looked at her suspiciously. It gets thinner? Magician Thrumwald says it gets thicker, and that is what holds the planets in their places. Uhura blinked. No, I'm afraid not. Good. Old Thrumwald is an idiot, always telling me we are the last, that we must do something about the food synthesizers. Bedalian kicked at the bed. Old fool. Wait until I tell him what you said. Your Majesty, he may be right about the other things. I imagine you're the last. Ambassador Spock was right. 2 of your planets are shattered, just orbiting rock. And this planet and another are cratered incredibly. Stop! He turned and shouted. Guards! Humanoid guards trotted in, thin spears at the ready. Take this giant back to her room. She bores me. She tells me truth and lies all mixed up. How can I decide which is real? Your Highness, But Uhura was all but carried back to the room where they had left Spock. Discouraged, she recounted what had happened. We must find those communicators, he said. The king mentioned a magician. I wondered if he might not be a kind of hereditary technician. Let us go see. Spock rose, and Uhura sat up in surprise. The guards, Mr. Spock, She heard 2 bodies plop onto the floor with a rattle of equipment. Come, Spock said, looking back through the curtain. Uhura followed him, stepping over the 2 unconscious guards, who reminded her of sleeping children in dress-up. They hurried along until they ran into a surprised noble. Noble sir, Spock said, bowing, might you tell me where the quarters of the magician Thrumwald might be? The noble looked at them suspiciously. You don't fright me, you great hulks. I assure you, sir, we have no intention of frightening you. However, we have urgent business with magician Thrumwald. Well, he certainly doesn't live in the palace. Try the slave quarters. I heard once he lived somewhere in there. Why do you want to see him anyway? He's just a magician. Urgent business, Spock said. Sent by the king, Uhura added. Oh, very well. The small humanoid turned and pointed. Down that way, green door on the left. Mind you bathe when you come back. Most assuredly, Uhura said, setting off after the long-legged Spock. Definitely. The green door was unguarded on the palace side, but there were rather large cockroach guards on the other side. They did not say or do anything as Spock and Uhura came through. The quarters of the magician Thrumwald, Spock demanded. They pointed with their spears, their eye stalks swaying. After a long walk and numerous inquiries, they found a bridge across a cavern and a masonry tower on the other side, a square-built structure of black stone without windows except for the highest levels. The bridge, however, was guarded. "What is that?" Uhura gasped. Sitting in the middle of the bridge was what seemed to be a cross between the galaxy's largest caterpillar and an armored beetle. "Metaphorically, it's a dragon," Spock said. "And just what, metaphorically, are you going to do about it?" Uhura asked. "Commander, the proper question is what are we going to do about it?" "Correction noted," she said wryly. "Uh-oh, it notices us." "That is what it is supposed to do," Spock said. He stepped out confidently onto the bridge. The great armored caterpillar rippled and lifted a third of its length into the air. It towered above them by 3 times their height, but Spock just kept walking confidently toward it. "Mr. Spock," Uhura wheezed, "You there," Spock's voice thundered, repeated in volume from the translator. The caterpillar stopped moving, except for a thicket of antennae atop its head, which kept on waving. "We wish to speak to the magician Thrumwald." "Chick, chick, click, chop, choop, choop, click, 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 clunk," the caterpillar said, but the translator was silent. It simply didn't have enough material upon which to base a translation. "Step aside," Spock said, his voice echoing in the cavern. Uhura saw stirring at a curtained window in the tower. "I must speak to the great and renowned magician Thrumwald." Uhura trotted from her post of concealment and quickly spoke in a loud voice. "His fame is spread to the great empire of the Federation, to those who would seek his advice." She grinned up at Spock. "I can lie better than you," she whispered. "So it would seem, Commander Uhura," Spock responded. "Chick, clonk, click, click, punk, chick, chop, chick, click, pump." "Aside," Spock said. The creature still loomed over him like a shuttlecraft on end. "We bear great news to the great magician Thrumwald." "Clunk, chick, click, punk, blink, clunk, chick, click, pump." The translator hummed alive in a scratchy voice, said, "No, go, I guard, kill, go." "Great guardian of the gates," Uhura said loudly. "Only a magician as great as Thrumwald could have such a magnificent guardian. How great must be his powers. We must see him to praise him." "Don't overdo it," Spock muttered. "Chick, click, punk, chick, clack, spoop, click, chick." "No, I must kill you now." "Stop!" From a high window, Spock and Uhura saw a hand wave. They could see a figure and heard his cry, which sounded like, "Click, chook, chick, pump, click, chum." The great caterpillar rumbled and fumed, but edged aside enough for Spock and Uhura to get by. They went quickly across the bridge and up to the base of the isolated tower. Then, after a few moments, a wooden door creaked open and a voice said, come in, you great hulking beasts." As the door closed, Uhura looked around to see a humanoid figure no higher than her waist, almost an elf of a person, white-haired and dressed in black. Then the door clicked shut and the small person glared at them. "Now what? You're those obscenely big ambassadors, aren't you? The ones that told the king all those lies. Don't deny it, I know you are. Only giants around. What do you want here? I'm ready for you, you know. I have the spell of invisibility ready. I'm the master of the barbs of annoyance. My father was the last magician Thrumwald, you know, and he taught me everything. How to test for poison drink, how to create light, how to ward off strange beings by making them sneeze, how to turn chittick to stone, all the good stuff. Well, speak up, will you? I'm right in the middle of a test, so don't take up my time. You're certainly a big female, aren't you? You with this pointed-eared giant, are you? Too bad. Wouldn't mind the challenge myself. Of course, I'm not as young as I was. Once there was a time when I, alone and armed with only a few ready spells, could have loved my way through the hall of the countesses all by myself. Long time gone that. Well, come on, speak up. We're trying, Uhura snapped. The magician looked at her in surprise. Well, you don't have to get like that. My fourth wife, the Lady Varen of Apuldia, mistress of the Southern Cavern, firstborn daughter of the defender of Zanisi, she was like you, full of surprises. Got to be a darn nuisance. No familiar, comfortable routine, always a life of novelty. Too young for me, they said, and they were right, the old biddies. Now my sixth wife, the Baroness of Owentel, the Queen's Mirror, she was different. As quiet as a sulpat and mixed all my secret potions just right. You don't strike me as being like her, you great brown mountain of a woman. Now if you—" "Magician Thrumwald," Spock said loudly, "we are looking for our communicators. Metal boxes about this big." "Oh, those. Dreadful frightening things. Yes, they're here. They always bring me things they want fixed, like I'm supposed to know everything. I do, of course, but not everything. Can't expect me to know everything about something I've never seen before. From outside, are you? Good. I told the king, I told his father, I told his grandfather, that blind old croot. I told them things were going to belaz in a basket. Close the whole North Cavern down and medallion the 38s with time. But doesn't anyone remember? No. They think this is the way it always was. Fools, all of them fools. They expect me, just me, mind you, now that the 9th wife is gone, me to fix a power thing, but they're afraid of me too, the boneheads. Won't tell me what's wrong, but I'm supposed to fix it anyway. Wasn't this way in my great-grandfather's time, I tell you. The kings then listened. That was in the days when the Quakes were still bringing down the roofs and the Krits were roaming the caverns looking for food. No, then the kings listened. But do they listen these days? No. They're omnipotent, these kings today, great and noble in their ignorance and— "Magician, please," Uhura said, "the communicators." In there, he said impatiently. "Go on, right through there, up those steps. Go on. Watch your heads, you great mountains of meat. Go on, in there to the right. Why did you giants have to come now? Disrupt a person's life? Make me yell at the last Krut that exists? It's hard to train a Krut, you know, very hard. My grandfather started training that one when it was still in the egg. Played him music from Skrukin's pieces, the triumphal march of the rightful king and the cavern echoes in memory of Surface. Kruts love music, if you get 'em young enough. You ever train a Krut?" he demanded of Uhura. "What? No." The little person looked happy. "Good, you passed the first test. These boneheads are always bragging how they trained a wild Krut, the fools. Liars. That's the only trained Krut in the universe." "Our communicators?" Uhura said, grateful for a slight break. "Where are they?" "Why? What are you going to do with them? You set up a rival magician fife, and I'll bring down the sores of Bakar on you. I'll cause your bones to bend, I'll electrify your hair, "No, please, just tell us where they are," she said. "What do I care? I'm old. There's no children to carry on. I'd like to go out in a great explosion of magic, summon all the powers together at once, set them against each other, and go out in a great flash." He fell silent, smiling. "The communicators?" Spock asked. "Oh, they're over there somewhere, behind that pickled Krut egg. No, to the left, there. That's them, right? Couldn't make head nor tail of them. My father was good with powered things. Not me. Don't have the touch. Now, purpley plants and now that's different. If you—" He stopped as Spock flicked open a communicator and the bleep of the sound came to him. He looked startled and grasped at a rod of twisted colored glass. "Don't come near me, you meaty hunks of alien stuff. I can defend myself. This will turn even you into jelly. Watch it now, you—" "Enterprise, this is Commander Spock." "Spock!" It was the voice of Captain Kirk. "Are you in trouble, laddie?" Commander Scott asked. "We can beam you up in an instant." "Are you all right?" Kirk demanded. "Where's Uhura?" "We're fine, Admiral. Commander Uhura is here with me." Quickly, Spock outlined the situation. "I think the Prime Directive gives us enough leeway to offer them the option of going or staying," Kirk said. But I don't like the slave race situation." "Who is he talking to?" the magician asked in an odd voice. "Our captain," Uhura said, pointing up. "He's out there." "There's nothing out there," the magician snapped. "Proven fact." "There's a starship out there," Uhura smiled, "and another home if you want." "Why should I leave here?" he growled. "Not that I don't have my troubles. Do you know what it costs to feed a Krut these days? And powdered Eric horn? Can you guess what they were asking? Recycled coppered wire, flum, a good grade of barlick? No, people never think of that. They see the glamorous life, the king's court, the balls and parties, the apprentice magicians, all adoring with their sweet eyes. No, that's all people see." "Please," Uhura said, putting a finger to her lips as she watched Spock talk to Kirk. But the magician was not to be silenced. "And you two great buffoons come in. Do they just run you through and that's that? No, they expect me to take care of things. Drain your mind and turn you to stone. That's what Beeler wanted. Turn to stone? And me without a gram of Darisk in the whole tower. Count Fremla, he wanted to torture you, whatever your name is. Uhura. Yes, he was all for that. If I immobilized you, oh yes, he loves torturing the crew. And the Queen, oh dear me, what she wanted me to do with your pointed-eared friend. Well, Gigantus Robotus, that's what she wanted. The wanton. Her mother was the same, her grandmother and her mother. All the same, the whole Fernalis line, all the same. Not one of them could splice a copper line of Frila and Omiker to save their minds, but all they do is say, do this for us, Thrumwald, and do that for us, Thrumwald. That's a dear. It'll be a great day when the Chittick eats them all. Then I can devote myself to Eek! 4 columns of shimmering light appeared in the magician's room, and he cowered back against the wall, holding out a shaking hand, pointing his colored glass rod. Don't, Uhura said, shoving at his arm. A searing flame melted rock from the roof, and it dripped out in splatters as the security team materialized. Sergeant Galloway, Uhura said, help me with him. Galloway wrested away the glass rod and started to break it, but Spock snapped out an order to stop. There's too much energy in that to release at once, Sergeant. Yes, sir, Galloway said, putting the rod carefully down on a bench. He flipped open his communicator. Second team, hop it. Thrumwald stared in horrified fascination as teams of armed men materialized out of the air, dressed in red uniforms. They moved downstairs and established a perimeter around the Black Tower. Then Admiral James T. Kirk appeared with Dr. McCoy and young Lex Nakashima. Sulu has a con, Kirk said. Scott is ready to back us up as needed. That will not be necessary, Admiral, Spock said. This show of force is mainly psychological. Kirk looked up at the still glowing stone ceiling, carved from great interlocked basalt blocks, but he didn't say anything except, Proceed, Mr. Spock, this is your show. When the security men left the Black Tower, they were confronted by the Krut looming up over them, its many legs kicking and its antennae quivering. Phasers poured power into great undulating bulk, but it took a long time for the peculiar nervous system to receive a knockout jolt. The Krut finally subsided and rolled up in a ball and went to sleep. Galloway wiped the perspiration from his forehead and spoke to Spock. Any more surprises like that one, sir? Surprises? Yes, Sergeant. Like that? No, I don't think so. Why do I have to go? Muttered the magician Thrumwald. They see me with you and they'll think I betrayed them. Better tie my hands and put one of those odd weapons veers to my head. After all, I have to live here after you people are gone. You have no right to compromise me like this, insensitive monsters. All you giants are alike. Unfeeling brutes, that's what you are. Sergeant, after you've tied the magician's hands, gag him as well, Spock said. Yes, sir, Galloway said, grinning. Friedman? Oh, very well, the magician said, but you'll be sorry. All the kingdom comes to me sooner or later for my advice. Why should you be different? All I want is... Sergeant, the gag. The magician shut up, and Galloway didn't gag him, winking at the impassive Spock. They crossed the bridge, edging along past the knockout Krut, and entered the palace. Consternation reigned as the small creatures ran in every direction, squealing. The Chittick hopped and trotted away before the onslaught of the giants. Here and there, one tried to take a stand and was stunned by phasers and laid out in a side passage. Within minutes, Spock, Uhura, and the magician, followed by an observant Admiral Kirk and a fussy Dr. McCoy, entered the throne room. The pyramid of thrones and lesser thrones was empty except for the top 2. King Bedalion and his queen sat with stiff dignity on their thrones, unattended by any nobles or slaves. The queen managed to look frightened, excited, and angry all at the same time. Bedalion switched from shock to anger to curiosity to outraged dignity in no particular order. Stop where you are, he shouted, his voice cracking. You great lumbering louts are liable to break my floors. Majesty, Spock said, stepping forward, we offer transportation to a new land, a place under the stars and a new sun. Medallion looked surprised, then woefully shocked. No, never. Ugh, horrible idea. A sun shining right down on us? No roof, no ceiling, nothing over our heads to protect us? We'd float up and out into whatever is out there. I assure your majesty that there are many suitable uninhabited planets. Your system here is breaking down. You do not have the ability to repair them. Stop! I will hear no more of this. We have lived here in harmony for over 300 generations. There is no other life for us. We have everything here. You have slaves, Uhura said with some heat. Slaves? Of course we have slaves, you silly giant. How else does one live? How can you be a master race without a slave race? Exactly, muttered Uhura. We would offer the Chittick an equal opportunity, of course, Spock said. A planet of their own, where they could develop as naturally as possible. Bedalion looked shocked, and the queen eeked. Do I understand you point-eared giant to mean that you would steal our slaves from us? But they're ours. See the metal collars they all wear? A most satisfactory pacification device. He held up his hand. See this? All we of noble rank wear this. A touch. The Enterprise landing party heard threshing and thin, reedy screams from the side rooms. And all within 10 sardoms feel real pain. Stop! Uhura yelled. The king looked at her from his lofty perch, raising his delicate eyebrows. It's the only way, you huge thing. It is an ancient maxim of our people. Masters command as best they can, and slaves obey as they must. Surely you see the sense in that. We are prepared to offer the Chittick the choice, Spock said impassively. Choice? The Queen squealed. Choice for slaves? They are intelligent beings, Majesty, Spock said. The Federation will insist that... Curse your Federation, the king shouted, standing. Curse your blundering giants. You cannot deal with giants except by force. Force is the only thing you great brutes understand. The king seized a medallion which hung from his neck, along with others, and thumbed 3 of the jewels. The pyramid of thrones seemed to fall apart as the backs of a lower ring of thrones flopped inward and curious crystalline snouts protruded. Spock fired at once, disintegrating one of them, and the suddenness of it surprised everyone. The crystals glowed, and each of the humans was bathed in an aura of intense pain. Their skin seemed to be on fire, their teeth hurt, their heads all ached, their muscles were knotted. Uhura screamed and fell to her knees. The security men threshed about. Galloway, Friedman, and Lieutenant Nakashima all fired right at the pulsating crystal snouts. The pyramid of thrones was lost in a cloud of steam, flashes, and exploding stone. Cease fire! Kirk yelled, as Spock ran straight at the pyramid. Only he and those near him had escaped the deadly ray because of his destruction of the crystal weapon. Spock bounded up the pyramid, using the thrones as steps. King Bedalion was in shock, staring around him at the ancient center of power in ruins. Spock ripped the medallion from him and stood over him. We will offer each of your subjects and the Chittick as well an option, Your Majesty. Bedalion stared at him, unable to speak for a long moment. You ruined my throne. You ruined my throne. Everybody aboard, Mr. Spock? Admiral Kirk said from the command chair. Yes, Admiral. More than 3/4 of the humanoid race voted on the first ballot to move, and, of course, all of the Chittick. After a few lessons in what democracy means, Uhura said with a smile, it was not an easy concept for a race bred to centuries of slavery to understand. Every individual seeks personal freedom, Kirk said, once they understand it is possible. And the rest of them, Spock? Once they saw most were going, they changed their vote. Would you believe it, sir? Uhura said. Bedalion is acting as though it was all his idea, that he's the savior of the people. He's announced plans to run as president once they become established on Ion Aleph 3. And the Chittick? Kirk asked. They have a hive mind, Spock said. I've selected Lon Kafka II in the Aleph sector, Admiral, if you approve. That's a good distance from Ion? 9 light years, sir. Good, Spock. And the talkative magician Thrumwald? He's the one who